Hello, everyone. Let's go ahead and get talking about the file import utility. And so this is a new and exciting utility that we have available, a tool, if you will, that is meant for creating and updating data in Blue Mountain RAM a little more efficiently. And it's really intended for those that's seeking functionality for you get multiple assets at one time, maybe hundreds of them, and instead of doing those manually into the system individually, you can have this tool that will import those all at once. Not only is it creating those records for you in RAM, but also any updates that you may want. And so, those functions may not be for everybody, but for those that do have those scenarios where you have large groups of assets that you get at once, this tool is meant for you and really designed for you. We still have those services available for doing, one-time migrations. They're still available, but this tool is really meant for your purposes that you can use over and over again, and it would be yours as part of, a subscription if you're in the cloud. So kind of moving forward beyond that is, I touched upon some of these, but again, the tool is meant for quickly adding the assets as opposed to individually adding them through RAM's interface. You can manipulate the schedules. Maybe some of you are aware of the batch update tool inside of RAM. However, that tool is great if you're making the same modification to a record for many records. This tool would be able to modify those records with different data all at once. So it's a little different. The efficiency that you would gain from this, well, you guys can do the calculations in your own, assuming that how long it takes to enter an asset manually versus this tool coming from a spreadsheet and importing directly. So there are some major gains and time savings there. And it's fairly simple to execute. So that's kind of what I wanted to show here as part of this lab, is to go over the process of how this works, give you guys a great idea of how it behaves for that matter. This particular style of implementation, this execution is very similar to integrations that we have, where it's a file drop style of integration. And so we have integrations with other systems out there, ERP, MES systems, LIMS systems, and then we have the file import utility now, which is, again, very similar to how we do integrations. So a high-level look at the process if we go through these steps. Okay, so first off, you have an Excel spreadsheet, right? And there's headers on that spreadsheet, which you can export a query out of RAM, as many of you might know, and you can leverage that export to build your spreadsheet. And I'll kind of walk through that as well. But again, we want to do first maybe have a lecture about this, and then we'll go through looking at it in real time. And so you have that built, you have your columns, you build out your data in that spreadsheet. Something important as part of the process is you would then make that spreadsheet and save it as a TXT file, Unicode text format. Okay, and then once that's established, you put that file into a controlled access folder, which we call either an inbound folder or an import folder, just something to represent that this is going into RAM. And we set this up during the initial setup of this particular utility for you. Then after that file is dropped there, you're effectively done for what you need to do. It's up to now the job. There's a background job that will run up to 2 times a day, and it's scheduled for those 2 times per day, which will then trigger to the job to run on that folder. It'll pick that file up, import those rows that are in that file into RAM, and then after that execution happens, it will then take that file and move it to an archive folder. So at a high level, that's kind of what that process is. I already went ahead and said the inbound folder moved to the archive folder. So, and then after all that's done, it's moved to the archive folder. We then get a confirmation, if you will, of any errors that may have happened. So as part of the setup, there are going to be people that will be in the recipients of that particular message, which you guys would tell us who do you want to get that message. But ultimately, this, an email would get sent out saying, hey, this job ran, this file, and if there were any errors, it would list those out and what they are, okay? And I have an example of what that message looks like. So to visualize the process of what we just talked about is in RAM, so just the interface, I took a screenshot here. Mind you, I will actually get into the system and show you this, but you export your query out. This query, this particular one has certain columns on it, right? So you export it out and you effectively get a spreadsheet, right, an Excel spreadsheet of that data. What you can do is you can delete that data out because it's exporting from RAM. You're not re-importing that data. You're importing different data. You're effectively trying to model the column headers, not really the data that's already there. You're going to populate this with the columns out of RAM. In my case, I have an example here, and it's an Excel spreadsheet right now, and I left my asset ID column blank in this particular case. In some of your configurations, you might have, you will have differences in how you create your asset IDs. It's important to know that if you have RAM automatically creating your IDs for you, you would leave this column blank. Because RAM will, once it gets imported, RAM will define what those are within RAM, and it'll be a unique ID. Otherwise, if it's a manual entry for how you create your IDs on your own naming convention, you would then populate these IDs in the column of your spreadsheets. Okay. So let's say I did that. I then save it, as I mentioned, to a Unicode text, a TXT format file, which is what this is looking like. And on this particular file, there's a couple areas, or one specific area that I want to draw your attention to. This is in the upper left. The file name of this is very important when it comes to the import utility. So one question might be, well, what records does this apply to? Well, it applies to these ones, right? So you could import equipment, you could import systems, loops, calibration events, schedules, maintenance. I'm not going to read all this, you can read it yourself. But effectively, these record types have a prefix to them that you need to put onto your file name at the beginning of it. That's how the tool knows where these records, or what records to create in RAM, okay? And then there's all naming conventions, best practice here to have a unique file name throughout, but the beginning, the prefix part is important to know. You don't have to memorize this. This is all in a document we have available to those that would like this utility, usage guide, if you will, that will be available to you. Okay. And like I said, you'll see 3 different folders. We'll put the file, this TXT file, in the inbound folder, and then the job will run, and it'll move it to the archive folder. It's really as simple as that. It's not very complex. The process, once you know it, it's pretty simple. Okay. So with that in mind, I want to jump to the actual system inside of RAM. So I'm going to log in to RAM. Are there any questions?
Not yet.
None, really? Okay. So what I want to show initially is on my all assets query, I have 197 here right now. I may want to have, a series of other ones, hundreds of other ones that I get in, maybe on a yearly basis or a quarterly basis, whatever your business process needs and requires. Because right now this tool wasn't available before, and now it is. So again, we want to get awareness out there as well as best we can about this utility. So I have 197 right now. What I can do is, I mentioned you can export a query out of RAM and make it as a spreadsheet template for you to populate it with data. And so what I've done ahead of time is I've created a query, and I've dubbed it file import utility, right? And this is the reason of this query, the only purpose of this query is for me. And you can have it shared, of course, if you want others to use it for their purposes of mass import of data. But all I'm after is the column headers, right? So if I export this query, it just populates my columns for me that much easier. It's great to have this as a query option. That way you have the same columns and you can use the same columns over and over again. And as you use it more and more in the future, you have the same format every time. So I think that's important too, to keep consistency. It doesn't mean that you can have additional columns. You certainly can. You may have different naming on your columns than I do, and that's perfectly fine. The point is that you can use RAM to help create your spreadsheet template. Now, I've already created data in my spreadsheet, but obviously you can see I used the same columns I have in RAM, but just wanted to show that quickly. So in this particular spreadsheet, I have 4 more assets that I want to create. Obviously, you might have hundreds more listed here in each one of these rows, and it'll import that into there. And as I save this, again, it's EQ, so these are equipment that I'm going to import, so that's important to know. And I'm going to save this as a Unicode text, okay? And I'm going to put it into a folder called, and this will be mapped to a particular storage area. If you're in the cloud, it'll be in the Azure storage in the cloud. If you're on-premise, then you would have your folder structure somewhere located on your local area. But I want to put it into the inbound folder. And just to make sure this is unique, I'm just going to call it that. Okay. Once I save it, it's now a process of waiting for the job to run. As I mentioned, it'll be 2 times a day at a predefined schedule that you stipulate 2 times a day. So you would get notification via email about this. If I open up my Outlook right now, just give it a second here. We have a file, so a message came to me and said this file was processed. Right? So now if I go into my system, I got confirmation that it was processed. So I can go in and see, okay, did my assets get updated here? And lo and behold, it was 197, now it's at 201, which therefore those assets are now in there. And I can visually see those if I scroll down here, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So as you can see, this process really saves you the time from entering each individual assets one by one. I just put it in a spreadsheet and imported it directly into RAM. But from this point in time, you would then go into those assets if you needed to maybe put a schedule on them if you wanted to. The tool itself can also make schedules. So if you wanted to leverage the tool to make schedules, you can. Any additional information. However, the workflow behind it, it would have your workflow if you need to electronically sign from a review state to, active status. That would be up to you guys if you wanted to activate those once they are active, or you deem them as active. Okay, are there any questions of what you've seen so far?
Someone asked if this was available for only cloud or if it's also available for on-premise.
So it's available for both. For those folks that have an on-premise implementation, we do offer this, and it's available for those that are on-premise as well as cloud. If you are interested in this, you would talk with your regional sales manager directly about the options available to you, and they'll go over pricing and all that with you individually.
Does Blue Mountain have to install the process to integrate the saved queries?
No, no. The queries can be designed on the fly by yourselves. You don't need Blue Mountain to do that. It's not that the queries are a must-have. It's a nice-to-have if you go that route and use RAM's queries to help build your spreadsheets. The important part is the column headers in your spreadsheet, if you create it manually, will have to match the fields in the form that you're trying to import into, which is why it's just much easier to export a query than it is to build your own. And you would be able to build your own the way you want it in the columns and what order that you want your columns in and all that via the query.
Next question is this a standard feature or an add-on?
This would be an add-on. It's optional for those that truly need it and want it. it wasn't available before, but now it is.
Okay. Someone else asked, can you speak a little bit more about some different use cases?
For those folks that have, okay, so for example, I had one customer who they deal in a lot of refrigerators. Okay, they have a lot of need for keeping a particular asset cool. All right, and so they get hundreds of these particular fridges every quarter. And so instead of adding each one of those individually in RAM, it would just be much easier to import those all at once into RAM via the spreadsheet. So effectively, so that's kind of one scenario I've been pounding on here. But the other one would be if you have the a need for an update of a lot of information all at once. So I don't want to get you confused with the batch update tool, because that tool is good if you're doing multiple assets with the same change. Meaning, if I wanted to, these particular pieces of equipment, if I wanted to, oh, all right. Sorry, I got to get to a specific equipment. So if I wanted to do a batch update on multiple pieces of equipment at once, it would be with the same change. So if I wanted to change, I don't know, say, for all intents, the description, I'll say it's a yellow something, right? So this change would then be reflected of all pieces of equipment at the same time, which is, it has a purpose and is great. However, in the file import utility, you could go into that spreadsheet and go to a cell within that row and say, I need you to change to this, and then I need to change another one to a different entry. So they'll be different, right? So they'd be a different, what's the word I'm looking for? Entry, description, whatever the case is, different field value entirely. And so you could do that at once, as opposed to this tool. It only does, the one change for many. You could do a many to many with the file import utility.
Another customer asked, how would this get added to their application?
There'd be some setup involved, which Blue Mountain would take care of for you. You wouldn't have to do this on your own. And there would be some training involved with this particular utility. It would be quick and short. It wouldn't be days of this. It would be hours of training. And with that, you should be able to use this pretty quickly. So it's not a difficult thing to implement or set up. It's pretty simple. Once, a couple hours with you to go over it, and then you should be off with races.
Are all fields available to import?
All fields. So not all fields will be available for import. There are some limitations to the fields that we can import. There is a list of fields that can be imported. If I go to the utility usage guide, let me see if I can find it quickly. Yeah, so it's header level data. When we talk about asset header level, event header, those are those fields that aren't within the grids, like the view menu areas, checkboxes, locations, personnel. These are all records and fields that we can import. Again, this usage guide will be available to you upon purchase.
Okay. Somebody else wants to know if you can show the audit trail for one of the new assets that you added.
Yes. Good point. So let me open up one of those. Open audit trail. And so with this particular ad that I did, it's saying RAM API user is the one that did this ad. That's because we use the API user in this case for this particular process. And that's what you would see whenever these get added or modified via the updates. path if you wanted to do that. So this is what it would look like.
All right, we did have a few more questions come in. The first was someone had asked about cost.
So cost is, there's some dependencies there, whether you're on-prem or cloud. The best answer I can provide you right now is reach out to your regional sales manager and they'll be able to provide you pricing. So I recommend you to do that.
Next question is, does the tool generate a disposition log for each record attempted to add or update?
Does it have a log that it attempted to?
Add or update, or an error?
I meant to show errors. I haven't done that yet. The system, so RAM won't, to my knowledge, will not do that. However, you do get notified of any errors that the job had. SQL Server will show the logs of the job running, and then any errors that if the job had, it would display in the logs of the SQL side. It wouldn't show it in RAM per se. The one email that I wanted to show just to give you an idea of what it looks like is, this is one job that we ran a while ago, but it shows some errors, some messages here that I came across in my testing around with it. But you get to see what these look like, and you get these and go to each one.
Next question is, can you import data to existing records, or is it for new records only?
You can change. So if it's an existing record, you're saying you're doing an update function, which the import utility tool can do. It would be as simple as me going, if I went back in that spreadsheet and I wanted to make updates to those very same assets that I just created, I would leave the ID the same value and then update those cells in each row that I want to update, and then put that file back in that inbound folder, and the job will pick it up, and then you'll have your updates applied, assuming no errors.
Can you add an audit trail comment on the import, or is it by default?
It would be by default. I imagine any customizations like that could be discussed with your RSM. Nothing's really off the table until it's discussed thoroughly. But I would suggest, again, talking to your RSM about that particular option. Thanks, everyone.